My wife was cheating on me. I found out that my sons knew about it, but kept it a secret. One son took my side and supported me, while the other blamed me for destroying the family. For most of my life, I believed I had hit the jackpot when it came to family. My wife, Kathleen, and I had been married for 35 years, and I always thought our relationship was the kind of story people envied. We met when we were in our early 20s, and from the moment I saw her, I was smitten. Kathleen had this warm smile and a magnetic personality that could light up any room. Our marriage, to me, felt solid, full of love, laughter, and mutual respect. We had two sons, Brian, 29, and Derek, 27. Both of them turned out to be great kids, kind, respectful, and hardworking. I had this deep sense of pride every time I looked at them, knowing Kathleen and I had built a home where they could thrive. We weren't the type of family to air our dirty laundry. We tackled problems quietly and together. Or at least, I thought we did. Our home was the quintessential suburban dream. A cozy two-story house with a well-kept lawn, a backyard that Kathleen loved to fill with flowers, and the kind of kitchen where we spent hours talking, cooking, and laughing. I'm a big believer in traditions, so Sunday family dinners were non-negotiable. No matter how busy everyone got, we always found time to sit together, catch up, and reconnect. Those nights were sacred to me. As a husband, I thought I did everything right. I worked hard to provide for my family, treated Kathleen with respect, and made it a point to show her I cared, even in the small ways, like surprising her with her favorite coffee or planning weekend getaways. We weren't perfect, no one is, but our disagreements were minor. Or so I thought. Looking back now, I realize how blind I was to the cracks in the foundation. Kathleen was great at making everything seem fine on the surface. If she was upset, she'd wave it off with a smile or change the subject. And honestly, I didn't push. I trusted her implicitly. She was my partner, the person I'd built my life with. Why would I question anything? Our boys were thriving, too. Brian, our eldest, worked in finance and lived in the city, while Derek was an engineer and had just bought his first home. Both of them were in relationships, and it warmed my heart to see them finding happiness. Kathleen loved being a mom, and I thought that role brought her as much joy as it did me. Life, for 35 years, felt idyllic. I felt lucky every single day. But then everything changed. It started as an ordinary Thursday. Kathleen was bustling around the house, getting ready to meet up with a few friends for what she called her girls' dinner. This wasn't unusual. She had a tight-knit group of friends from her college days, and they made it a point to catch up every month. As always, she kissed me on the cheek before leaving, smiling warmly. "Don't wait up," she said. "I might be late." I didn't think much of it. I had my own plans. Brian was coming over for a quick chat about some career decisions he was facing, so I spent the evening catching up with him. He left around 9 p.m., and I settled into the couch to watch some late-night TV. It was a quiet, uneventful evening. At least, it was until Kathleen got home. She came in a little after midnight, wearing her usual excuse of exhaustion like a mask. "Sorry it's so late," she said, giving me a tired smile. I didn't press her, assuming she'd had a good time with her friends. We went to bed, and life moved on. But then, 2 weeks later, I found the message. Kathleen had left her phone on the kitchen counter while she ran upstairs to grab her purse. We were supposed to head out for lunch together, and I was just killing time when her screen lit up with a notification. Normally, I'd never snoop, but this wasn't some random app notification. It was a text. From a name I didn't recognize. Greg H. The preview read, "Last night was incredible. I can't stop thinking about you. Counting the hours until I see you again." My stomach dropped. I stared at the phone, my mind racing. There had to be some kind of explanation, right? Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe it was meant for someone else. But the sick feeling in my gut wouldn't go away. Before I could stop myself, I picked up her phone and unlocked it. Something she'd shared with me years ago, but that I'd never had a reason to use. The full message thread between Kathleen and Greg was laid out in front of me like a train wreck I couldn't look away from. It wasn't just one message. There were dozens. Messages about meeting up at hotels. Explicit details about their nights together. Promises of love. Plans to be together. One message from Greg stood out like a slap in the face. I'm so glad you could get away from your family dinner. It's cute that you keep up appearances, but we both know where your heart really is. Family dinner. That phrase hit me like a brick. Kathleen wasn't with her friends that night. She was with him. Suddenly, all those nights she'd come home late and exhausted took on a completely different meaning. My chest tightened, and I felt like I couldn't breathe. I didn't confront her right away. I needed more proof, something concrete that she couldn't wiggle her way out of. Kathleen was smart, and if I came at her with accusations based only on texts, she'd probably have some excuse lined up. So I decided to dig deeper. The next day, while she was in the shower, I went through her phone again. There were photos, pictures of her and Greg together at what looked like a resort, laughing and holding each other. One was time-stamped from a weekend she claimed to be visiting her sister. There were also emails. She'd created a secret email account to communicate with him, and their correspondence was just as damning as the texts. They had been seeing each other for over 3 years. The betrayal hit me in waves. First came the disbelief, then the anger. How could she do this to me? To us? To our family? For 35 years, I had been faithful, supportive, and loving. I had given her everything. And for what? To be lied to? Cheated on? My mind was a storm of emotions, and I couldn't focus on anything else. I decided to track her movements. If Kathleen was meeting Greg, I wanted to know where and when. I installed a GPS tracker on her car, something I never thought I'd resort to, but at that point, I needed answers. Within a week, my suspicions were confirmed. She wasn't going to girls' dinners. She was meeting Greg at a hotel on the other side of town. The night I finally saw her with him was surreal. I parked my car across the street from the hotel and waited. Sure enough, Kathleen's car pulled into the lot, and she stepped out, wearing a dress I had complimented her on just a few weeks earlier. She walked inside without hesitation. 15 minutes later, a man followed, a tall, well-dressed guy in his late 40s or early 50s. He had a confident swagger that made my blood boil. This was Greg. I sat there for hours, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly they started to cramp. When they finally emerged, they were laughing and holding hands. Kathleen kissed him before they went their separate ways. Watching it felt like a knife twisting in my chest. When Kathleen came home that night, I pretended to be asleep. I couldn't face her, not yet. I needed to figure out what to do next. Divorce was the obvious answer, but it wasn't that simple. There were decades of shared history, intertwined finances, and our sons to think about. How would Brian and Derek react? Would they take her side? Would they hate me for exposing the truth? These questions kept me up all night. The next morning, Kathleen acted like everything was normal. She smiled, made coffee, and kissed me on the cheek before heading to the grocery store. I felt like I was living in a parallel universe where nothing made sense anymore. How could she look me in the eye and pretend everything was fine? I knew I couldn't keep this to myself forever. The truth was eating me alive, and I needed to confront her. But I wanted to be prepared. I started gathering every piece of evidence I could: screenshots of texts, emails, photos, GPS logs. I wanted to make sure she couldn't deny what she had done. Those weeks leading up to the confrontation were some of the hardest of my life. Every time I looked at Kathleen, I felt a mix of love, anger, and heartbreak. I didn't recognize the woman I had spent my life with. The lies, the deceit. It was like she had become a stranger overnight. But the most shocking part? She didn't even seem to feel guilty. If anything, she seemed happier, more alive. It was like her affair with Greg had given her a new lease on life, and that made her betrayal even more painful. She wasn't just cheating on me. She was thriving while doing it. Confronting Kathleen was already going to be hard enough. But the sons, the boys I had raised, sacrificed for, and cherished, they were supposed to be my rock. They were the pride of my life. I never imagined they'd have any part in this web of lies. Yet, as the days unfolded, I realized my betrayal wasn't just coming from Kathleen. It was coming from Brian and Derek too. After gathering enough evidence of Kathleen's affair, I decided to monitor her more closely. The turning point came when I overheard her on a phone call with Brian. She was in the living room, speaking softly, but I was in the next room, and the walls in our house weren't particularly thick. Her tone was lighthearted, almost teasing, as she said, "Thanks for covering for me last week. You're such a good son, Bree." My stomach twisted. Covering for what? I froze, trying to piece together what she could mean. I strained to hear more. Brian's voice, muffled but clear enough, responded, "Don't worry about it, Mom. Dad doesn't suspect anything. We've got your back." The words hit me like a freight train. We've got your back? My mind raced. It wasn't just Kathleen keeping secrets. Brian knew. Maybe Derek did too. And worse, they were helping her. I knew I couldn't react immediately. I needed proof, something undeniable that would force them to admit the truth. The idea that my sons were complicit in covering up their mother's infidelity was almost too much to bear. But I had to know for sure. The next day, while Kathleen was out, I called Brian. I kept my voice casual, asking him about work, his girlfriend, and how things were going. After a few minutes of small talk, I brought up Kathleen. "She's been going out a lot lately," I said, keeping my tone light. "I guess those girls' nights have been pretty frequent, huh?" There was a pause, just long enough for me to sense the hesitation. "Yeah," Brian replied, his voice a little too careful. "She's just been busy with her friends, you know. They're close." His response only made me more suspicious. He was lying. I could hear it in his voice. But I didn't press him. Not yet. Later that week, I decided to check Kathleen's phone again. This time, I searched for messages between her and our sons. What I found confirmed my worst fears. There were texts from both Brian and Derek discussing her affair. They weren't just aware of it. They were actively helping her cover it up. One message from Derek to Kathleen read, "Don't worry, Mom. If Dad asks, I'll say you were with me last night." Another from Brian, "Greg seems like a good guy. I'm glad you're happy, but you've got to be careful. Dad can't find out." My blood boiled as I read through the messages. These were my sons. The boys I had raised to be honest, to have integrity. And they were lying to my face, protecting their mother while I was left in the dark. It was a betrayal I couldn't comprehend. I decided it was time to make my move. I needed to expose the truth in a way that none of them could deny. That weekend, I followed Kathleen to one of her rendezvous spots, a restaurant downtown. Sure enough, she was there with Greg, laughing and sipping wine like they didn't have a care in the world. I snapped a picture of them together. It was the perfect shot, Kathleen's hand resting on Greg's arm, both of them looking at each other with smiles that made me sick to my stomach. When I got home, I uploaded the photo to our family group chat. The caption was simple but cutting. "Hope you're having a great family dinner." The fallout was immediate. Within minutes, my phone started blowing up. Derek called first, but I ignored it. Then Brian. Then Kathleen. I didn't answer any of them. I wanted them to sit with the weight of what they had done. The group chat exploded with messages. Derek. "Dad, this isn't what it looks like." Brian. "We can explain. Please don't do anything rash." Kathleen. "We need to talk. Please, can we talk?" Their excuses and pleas only made me angrier. They weren't sorry for what they had done. They were sorry they got caught. That evening, Kathleen came home in a panic. She rushed into the house, her face pale and eyes wide. "We need to talk," she said, her voice shaking. I stood my ground, arms crossed. "Talk about what, Kathleen?" "About how you've been lying to me for years. About how you've roped our sons into your lies." Her mouth opened and closed like she was searching for the right words, but nothing came out. She looked genuinely shocked that I knew so much. I didn't let her off the hook. "I know everything, Kathleen. I've seen the messages. I've read the emails. I've followed you. I've watched you walk into hotels with him." She sank into a chair, her head in her hands. "It's not what you think," she mumbled. "Don't you dare insult my intelligence," I snapped. "You've been cheating on me for years. And Brian and Derek? They've been covering for you." That last part seemed to hit her harder than anything else. "They didn't mean to hurt you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But they did," I shot back. "You all did." Brian and Derek showed up later that night, both of them looking as guilty as I'd ever seen them. Derek tried to apologize first. "Dad, we didn't know how to tell you. We didn't want to hurt you." I laughed bitterly. "So instead, you lied to me. Over and over again. You chose her over me." Brian tried to reason with me. "She's our mom. We love you both, but we didn't want to take sides. You took sides the moment you decided to cover for her, I said coldly. You didn't just betray me. You betrayed everything this family was supposed to stand for. The conversation went on for hours, but no amount of apologies could undo the damage they had done. By the end of the night, I was emotionally drained. Kathleen tried to hug me, but I pulled away. Don't, I said. Just don't. As I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I realized that my family, the family I had spent 35 years building, was shattered. The betrayal wasn't just from Kathleen. It was from all of them, and I didn't know if I could ever forgive them. The day I confronted Kathleen was the day my life took its sharpest turn. I had spent weeks gathering evidence, piecing together the shattered fragments of my trust, and preparing for this moment. Yet when it finally came, I wasn't ready for how raw and painful it would be. Kathleen was in the living room when I called her over. She must have sensed something was off because her usually composed demeanor faltered. She sat on the couch, her hands folded nervously in her lap, and asked, "What's wrong?" I held up my phone, showing her a picture of her and Greg laughing together at the restaurant. Her face turned ashen. "Do you have any idea what it feels like?" I began, my voice trembling. "To find out that your wife of 35 years has been cheating on you? To see her with another man and know she's been lying to your face for years?" Kathleen opened her mouth to speak, but I cut her off. "No, Kathleen, you don't get to talk. You don't get to twist this into some excuse or justification. I've seen the messages. I know about Greg. I know about the hotels. And I know about Brian and Derek covering for you." Her hands shot to her face, and she began to cry. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "Sorry," I said, laughing bitterly. "You're sorry now because you've been caught. If I hadn't found out, you'd still be sneaking around, wouldn't you?" Kathleen tried to grab my hand, but I pulled away. "It didn't mean anything," she pleaded. "I swear, it was just a mistake." "A mistake?" I shouted, my voice rising. 3 years of sneaking around isn't a mistake, Kathleen. It's a choice. Over and over again. You chose to betray me, betray our marriage, betray this family. Kathleen sat in stunned silence as I continued. "I'm done," I said, my voice cold. "I'm filing for divorce. There's nothing left to save here." Her tears intensified. "Please, don't do this," she begged. "We can fix this. We can go to counseling, start over." "There is no starting over," I interrupted. "You killed this marriage the moment you chose to be with him. And don't you dare try to pin this on me. I've been faithful, supportive, and loving for 35 years. You're the one who threw it all away." She didn't say anything after that, just sat there sobbing. For a moment, I felt a pang of guilt, but then I reminded myself of the texts, the emails, the lies. This wasn't my fault. It was hers. The next confrontation was with Brian and Derek. I called them both over the following day, determined to lay everything out on the table. They arrived together, looking uneasy, no doubt sensing the storm brewing. "Sit down," I said firmly. They obeyed, exchanging nervous glances. "I'm going to make this simple," I began. "I know about your mother's affair, and I know that both of you helped her cover it up." Brian's face turned red, and Derek looked down at his hands. Neither of them spoke. "You lied to me," I continued, my voice heavy with disappointment. "You chose to protect her lies instead of being honest with me. You betrayed me just like she did." "Dad, we didn't want to hurt you," Brian said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Well, you did," I replied sharply. "And now, there are consequences." Brian started to protest, but I held up a hand to silence him. "Brian, I know you're planning your wedding, and I know you were expecting me to pay for it. But after what you've done, don't count on it. If you need money, maybe you should ask your mom. Or better yet, her boss." His jaw dropped. "Dad, that's not fair," he stammered. "Fair?" I snapped. "You want to talk about fair? Was it fair to lie to me? To help your mother sneak around while I was left in the dark? Don't lecture me about fairness." Derek tried to step in. "Dad, come on. We were in a tough spot. We didn't know what to do." "You could have told me the truth," I shot back. "But you didn't. And now you're going to have to live with the consequences of that decision." The days that followed were a whirlwind of legal paperwork, tense conversations, and awkward silences. Kathleen tried several more times to talk to me, to convince me to give her another chance, but I shut her down every time. There was no coming back from this. I contacted a lawyer and began the process of filing for divorce. Kathleen tried to argue about the division of assets, claiming she deserved her fair share, but I wasn't interested in negotiating. You can take what's legally yours, I told her flatly. Nothing more. One of the hardest parts was telling people outside the family. Friends and extended relatives were shocked when they found out about the divorce, especially since we had always seemed like the perfect couple. Some tried to play peacemaker, urging me to reconsider, but I stood firm. You don't know the whole story, I told them, and honestly, I'm not interested in explaining it. Just know that this is the best decision for me. Brian and Derek eventually tried to make amends, but it was too little, too late. Brian called me one evening, his tone somber. Dad, I'm sorry, he said. I messed up. I should have been honest with you. I appreciate the apology, I replied, but it doesn't change what happened. You chose to lie to me, Brian. That's not something I can just forget. What about the wedding? He asked hesitantly. What about it? I said. Will you still come? I sighed. We'll see, I said, though deep down, I wasn't sure if I could bring myself to attend. The day Kathleen moved out was bittersweet. Part of me felt relieved to finally be rid of her lies and deceit, but another part of me mourned the life we had built together. Watching her pack up her things, I couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness. This wasn't how I had imagined our story ending. As she stood by the door, her bags in hand, she turned to me one last time. I'm sorry, she said, her voice thick with emotion. I know, I replied, but it's too late. And with that, she was gone. In the weeks that followed, I started to rebuild my life. It wasn't easy. 35 years of marriage doesn't just disappear overnight, but I was determined to move forward. I threw myself into work, hobbies, and reconnecting with old friends. Slowly but surely, I began to find a sense of peace. As for Kathleen, Brian, and Derek, our relationships remained strained. I still loved my sons, but things would never be the same between us. The trust had been broken, and trust, once lost, is hard to regain. But despite everything, I knew one thing for certain. I deserved better. After the storm of the divorce began to settle, there was one thing left weighing heavily on my heart: my relationship with Derek and Brian. No matter how betrayed I felt, these were my sons. I had raised them, loved them, and done everything in my power to give them the best lives possible. And yet, their role in Kathleen's affair had shattered my trust in them, leaving me unsure if I could ever look at them the same way again. Derek was the first to reach out. A week after Kathleen moved out, he called me. His voice was hesitant, almost apologetic, as he asked if we could meet. I agreed, hoping that he'd finally explain his side of things. We met at a small cafe not far from my house, a place we used to go when he was in high school and needed a quiet spot to talk. When he walked in, he looked nervous. He wasn't his usual confident self. Instead, he seemed almost fragile, like he was carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. He sat down across from me, clasping his hands together on the table. Dad, I'm sorry. For everything. I didn't respond right away. I wanted him to keep talking, to say what he needed to say without me steering the conversation. I know I messed up, he continued, his eyes fixed on his hands. I should have told you about Mom. I should have been honest with you from the start. Why didn't you? I asked, my voice steady but firm. Derek sighed, running a hand through his hair. I don't know. I guess. I didn't want to be the one to break everything apart. I thought maybe if I stayed quiet, things would just work themselves out. That's not how life works, Derek, I said, my tone sharpening. When you saw what she was doing, when you realized she was lying to me, you had a choice. And you chose to help her. You chose to betray me. I know, he said quickly, his voice breaking. I know, Dad. And I hate myself for it. I was trying to protect everyone, but I ended up hurting you the most. I'm so sorry. For a moment, I saw the boy I used to tuck in at night, the boy who used to run to me when he scraped his knee. He looked so broken, so desperate for forgiveness. But forgiveness wasn't something I could give so easily. I appreciate your apology, I said finally. But trust isn't something you can rebuild overnight. You lied to me, Derek. You made me feel like I was crazy, like I was imagining things. How am I supposed to trust you again? I'll do whatever it takes, he said earnestly. I just want to make things right. I nodded, but the truth was, I didn't know if things could ever be right again. The damage had been done. Unlike Derek, Brian didn't call to apologize or ask to meet. Instead, he showed up unannounced at my house one evening, his expression hard and defiant. Hey, he said curtly when I opened the door. He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, his posture stiff and his jaw tight. I could tell right away that this wasn't going to be a pleasant conversation. What do you want, Brian? I asked, crossing my arms. We need to talk, he said, his tone clipped. About everything. I gestured for him to sit down, but he shook his head. I'll stand, he said, his eyes narrowing. I just want to say my piece. Fine, I said, leaning against the wall. Go ahead. He took a deep breath, then launched into a tirade. I think you're blowing this whole thing out of proportion, he said, his voice rising. Yeah, Mom made a mistake. Yeah, she cheated. But divorcing her? Cutting her out of your life? Refusing to pay for my wedding? You're tearing this family apart, Dad. His words felt like a slap in the face. I'm tearing this family apart? I repeated, my voice icy. Your mother is the one who cheated. She's the one who lied to me for years. And you helped her. You lied to me, too. Don't you dare put this on me. Brian scoffed, shaking his head. You're so dramatic. It's not like she killed someone. People make mistakes, Dad. She's still our mom. And I'm still your father. I shot back. But that didn't stop you from betraying me. You chose her over me, Brian. You made your choice. And now you have to live with the consequences. You're acting like a child, he snapped. Holding grudges, cutting people off. It's pathetic. Pathetic? I repeated, my anger boiling over. What's pathetic is lying to your father to protect someone who destroyed our family. What's pathetic is standing here and trying to blame me for something I didn't cause. Brian didn't back down. You're ruining this family, he said again, his voice cold. You've turned this into a war, and for what? Your pride? It's not about pride, I said through gritted teeth. It's about respect. It's about trust. And both of those things are gone because of what you and your mother did. For a moment, we just stared at each other, the air between us thick with tension. Finally, Brian shook his head and turned toward the door. You know what? He said over his shoulder. Do whatever you want. I don't care anymore. And with that, he walked out, slamming the door behind him. After my conversations with Derek and Brian, I felt more alone than ever. Derek's apology was sincere, but I didn't know if I could fully believe him. Brian's coldness, on the other hand, left me reeling. I had always thought of him as the responsible one, the steady one. To see him act so callously was a betrayal I hadn't anticipated. For weeks, I wrestled with my feelings. I wanted to forgive them, to rebuild our relationships, but every time I thought about what they had done, the hurt and anger bubbled back to the surface. How could I trust them when they had proven that they were willing to lie to my face? How could I move forward when the people I loved most had been complicit in my wife's betrayal? The truth was, I didn't have any easy answers. All I could do was take things one day at a time and hope that, eventually, the pain would fade. But for now, the wounds were still fresh, and the path to healing felt impossibly long. After everything that had happened, the lies, the betrayal, the confrontation, it became clear to me that I needed to take control of my life in a way I hadn't before. The idea of leaving anything to Derek and Brian in my will felt like a slap in my own face. How could I reward them for the role they played in deceiving me? For choosing Kathleen over me? It wasn't a decision I made lightly, but it was one I knew I had to make. I met with my lawyer, Elizabeth Pierce, a few weeks after the divorce was finalized. Elizabeth had been handling my legal matters for years, and she'd seen me through some tough moments in the divorce. When I walked into her office that day, she gave me a sympathetic smile. "What can I do for you, John?" she asked, motioning for me to sit. I want to rewrite my will, I said without hesitation. My sons are out. I want everything to go to my sister, Susan, and her kids. Elizabeth raised an eyebrow but didn't question me. Okay, she said, pulling out a notepad. Do you want to make any provisions for Derek or Brian at all? Or cut them out completely? Cut them out completely, I said firmly. They've made their choices and I'm making mine. Over the next hour, Elizabeth and I went through the details. My house, worth $1.2 million, would go to Susan, along with the rest of my estate. Susan and I had always been close, and I trusted her implicitly. She had 3 children, Katie, Emma, and Max, and I knew she'd use the inheritance to give them a good life. As we finalized the paperwork, I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. This wasn't how I had envisioned things turning out, but it was necessary. When Derek found out about the will, he came to see me immediately. I wasn't surprised. Derek had always been the more emotional of the two, the one who wore his heart on his sleeve. He showed up at my door, looking distraught. "Dad, we need to talk," he said as soon as I opened the door. I stepped aside, letting him in. He followed me into the living room, where we sat across from each other. His hands were shaking slightly, and his voice cracked as he spoke. "I heard about the will," he began. "Is it true? Did you really cut us out?" "Yes," I said simply. "It's true." His face fell, and for a moment, he looked like a little boy again, the same boy who used to run to me when he had nightmares. But I couldn't let myself soften, not this time. "Dad, please," he said, his voice desperate. "I know I messed up. I know I hurt you, but I'm trying to make things right. I've apologized. I've done everything I can to show you that I'm sorry. Don't cut me out of your life like this," I sighed, leaning back in my chair. "Derek, this isn't just about the will. It's about trust. And right now, I don't trust you. You lied to me for years. You chose to protect your mother's lies instead of being honest with me. How am I supposed to look past that?" "I was scared," he said, tears welling up in his eyes. "I didn't know what to do. I thought I was protecting the family." "You weren't protecting the family," I said sharply. "You were protecting her. And in doing so, you betrayed me." He broke down then, his shoulders shaking as he cried. "I'm sorry, Dad," he sobbed. "I'm so sorry. Please don't do this. Don't cut me out." For a moment, I considered softening. I could see the pain in his eyes, the genuine regret. But then I remembered the messages, the lies, the nights I spent wondering what I had done to deserve this. I couldn't let my emotions cloud my judgment. "This isn't just about you, Derek," I said finally. "It's about setting boundaries. Actions have consequences, and this is the consequence of yours. Maybe one day, things will change. But for now, this is how it has to be." Brian's reaction, unsurprisingly, was the complete opposite. When he found out about the will, he called me, his voice dripping with anger. "So, you're cutting us out," he said without even a hello. "That's right," I said calmly. He let out a bitter laugh. "Unbelievable. You're really this petty?" "This isn't about being petty, Brian," I said. "It's about principle. You lied to me. You helped your mother betray me. Why should I leave anything to you? You're punishing us for trying to keep the family together," he snapped. "Do you have any idea how hard it was for us? Watching you and Mom fall apart, trying to hold everything together while you tore it down. Don't you dare put this on me," I said, my voice rising. "Your mother is the one who cheated. She's the one who destroyed this family. And you, both of you, chose to side with her. That was your decision, Brian. And this is mine." "You're pathetic," he spat. "You're so caught up in your own self-righteousness that you can't see the damage you're doing." "The damage was done long before this," I said coldly. "You made your choice, Brian. Now you have to live with it." He hung up on me after that, and I sat in silence, staring at the phone. I had expected his anger, but it still stung. Brian had always been the more headstrong of the two, but I never thought he'd turn on me like this. In the weeks that followed, I started to feel the weight of my decisions. Cutting my sons out of my will was a drastic step, but it felt necessary. I needed to protect myself, to set boundaries, to reclaim some sense of control after everything I had lost. But it wasn't easy. Every time I thought about Derek's tears or Brian's anger, I felt a pang of guilt. They were my sons, after all. I had loved them unconditionally for so long. But love wasn't enough to erase the pain they had caused. Susan, my sister, was supportive throughout the process. When I told her about the changes to my will, she nodded solemnly. "I understand," she said. "You need to do what's right for you." Her words gave me some comfort, but they didn't erase the ache in my chest. I had lost so much: my marriage, my trust, my relationship with my sons. And though I tried to focus on rebuilding my life, the scars of their betrayal remained. As time went on, I began to find a sense of peace. I threw myself into new hobbies, reconnected with old friends, and spent more time with Susan and her kids. They became a source of light in my life, a reminder that not all family bonds are broken. But even as I moved forward, the shadow of the past lingered. Trust, once shattered, is hard to rebuild. And for now, the distance between me and my sons felt insurmountable. The divorce from Kathleen was a drawn-out ordeal, but I had come to terms with the fact that it would take time to fully close that chapter of my life. Despite the emotional toll, I felt a sense of relief knowing that I was finally untangling myself from her lies and deceit. My lawyers assured me that Kathleen's claims on my assets were weak at best. Thanks to the prenuptial agreement we had signed decades ago and the evidence of her infidelity, they were confident she would walk away with far less than she had initially demanded. Kathleen, of course, wasn't going down without a fight. She hired a high-powered attorney, a man named Richard Crane, who was infamous for his aggressive tactics. The first few weeks of negotiations were tense. Kathleen and Richard tried to argue that her contributions as a homemaker entitled her to half of everything, despite her betrayal. My lawyer, Elizabeth, was a no-nonsense professional who wasn't easily intimidated. She countered every argument with precision, using the prenuptial agreement as a shield. "Kathleen's actions have consequences," Elizabeth reminded me during one of our meetings. "We have a strong case, and I don't see the judge awarding her anywhere near what she's asking for." Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of bitterness every time I saw Kathleen in court. She would sit across from me, her face carefully neutral, as if the years of love and trust between us had never existed. It was surreal to think that this woman, my wife of 35 years, the mother of my children, had become nothing more than a stranger fighting to take what she could from me. Outside of the courtroom, I began to focus on myself for the first time in years. After decades of putting my family first, I realized I had neglected my own happiness and well-being. I started going to the gym regularly, something I hadn't done since my 40s. It was slow going at first. My body protested the unfamiliar workouts, but as the weeks passed, I began to feel stronger, both physically and mentally. I also rediscovered old hobbies that had fallen by the wayside during my marriage. Photography had always been a passion of mine, and I dusted off my old camera, spending weekends exploring nearby parks and capturing landscapes. There was something deeply therapeutic about losing myself in the details of a shot, focusing on the beauty of the world around me instead of the chaos of my personal life. My sister, Susan, was an incredible source of support during this time. She would invite me over for dinner with her kids, and those evenings became a bright spot in my weeks. Her children, Katie, Emma, and Max, treated me with warmth and kindness, reminding me that not all family bonds were broken. Susan often encouraged me to open up about my feelings, and though it wasn't easy, I found solace in her understanding. "You're doing the right thing, John," she told me one evening over a glass of wine. "Focusing on yourself, setting boundaries, it's what you need to heal. Don't let anyone make you feel guilty for putting yourself first." Her words stuck with me. For too long, I had let guilt and obligation dictate my decisions. Now, I was learning to prioritize my own needs, even if it meant making difficult choices. Derek continued to reach out to me periodically. He would call or text, often apologizing again and asking if we could meet. Part of me wanted to let him back into my life completely. He seemed genuinely remorseful, and I could tell he was trying to rebuild the trust he had broken. We met a few times for coffee, and our conversations were cautious but civil. Derek would often bring up memories from his childhood, moments when we had been close, as if trying to remind me of the bond we once shared. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, Dad," he said during one of our meetings, "but I want to earn it. I'll do whatever it takes." His sincerity moved me, but the wounds were still too fresh for me to fully let my guard down. I wanted to believe that one day I could forgive him, but trust was a fragile thing, and I wasn't sure if it could ever be fully repaired. Brian, on the other hand, had made it clear that he had no interest in reconciling. His last conversation with me had ended in anger, and I hadn't heard from him since. I wasn't surprised. Brian had always been more stubborn and prideful than Derek, but it still hurt to know that my relationship with him might be over forever. One evening, I found myself looking through old photo albums, the kind I hadn't opened in years. There were pictures of family vacations, birthdays, and holidays, moments that seemed so perfect at the time. In one photo, Brian and Derek were building a sandcastle together on the beach, their faces lit up with joy. Seeing those images brought a lump to my throat. How had we gotten to this point? But then I reminded myself of everything that had happened. The lies, the betrayal, the choices they had made. Brian had shown no remorse, no willingness to take accountability. And as much as it pained me, I knew I couldn't keep reaching out to someone who refused to meet me halfway. The divorce was finalized 6 months after I filed. Kathleen walked away with far less than she had hoped for, and I kept the house and the majority of my assets. It felt like a small victory, though the emotional scars of the ordeal would take much longer to heal. With the legal battles behind me, I threw myself fully into my new life. I traveled to places I had always wanted to visit but never had the chance. Yellowstone, the Grand Canyon, even a week in Paris. Traveling alone was a strange but liberating experience. For the first time in years, I wasn't catering to anyone else's schedule or preferences. It was just me, living life on my own terms. Over time, I began to feel a sense of peace that had eluded me for years. The anger and bitterness that had consumed me during the divorce slowly started to fade. I still thought about Derek and Brian often, but I tried to focus on the good memories rather than the pain they had caused.